Good morning. My name is MARIETTE LIEFFERINK and I represent the Federation for a Sustainable Environment. My presentation this morning will focus primarily upon the gold and uranium mining within the Witwatersrand goldfields of South Africa. You may perhaps be worrying why I present on gold mining. It is because uranium is in fact a byproduct of the gold mining, and the gold tailings are in fact classified as uraniferous waste, that is waste containing uranium. The first slide, this one, shows the background to the Federation for a Sustainable Environment, which is a federation of community-based organizations, international and national non-governmental organizations, as well as conservancies. Our main focus is specifically on the realization of Section 24 of our Constitution, the Constitution of South Africa, which is the axiom of all our laws, namely the right to an environment that is not harmful to life and well-being, as well as to sustainable ecological development and justifiable economic and social development. The next slide shows the area upon which I will focus. This is the area that is colored in red, and this area is in fact the economic heartland or the hub of South Africa. It is the Witwatersrand goldfields. What is of interest in this area is that it also in this area is situated NAFCOR, the largest continuous producer of uranium oxide, as well as this area was the area which was, after the Cold War, the fourth largest producer of uranium after the United States, Canada, and the East Germany. What is also of significance that gold tailings, of course, contain elevated levels of uranium, high-grade uranium, and in fact more so than even genuine uranium tailings. It has been found by the European Environmental Bureau and the United States Environmental Protection Agency that mining waste constitutes the second greatest environmental risk next to global warming. The reason for that is the profound, often irreversible impacts of mining on ecosystems. In South Africa, gold mining with its associated uranium creates 47% of all mining waste. And the last bullet point is of interest to this conference because as a consequence of the uraniferous nature of the gold ore, the Witwatersrand tailings and mine residue areas contain significantly elevated uranium and also its daughter radionuclides, such as radium, and then of course we also have radon, and radon, bismuth, polonium, strontium, and so forth. The Witwatersrand goldfields, and I will just give an overview. It was mined over a period of more than 120, almost 130 years, by more than 120 mining companies. It created the largest gold and uranium mining basin in the world, which is currently flooded with acid mine drainage, and acid mine drainage contains radionuclides. It contains both toxic metals as well as radioactive metals. It also, because of the mining of 43 or extraction of 43 tons of gold and the extraction of 73,500 tons of uranium in the period between 1953 and 1995, it also resulted in tailings dams, 270 mine dumps or tailings dams containing 6 billion tons of iron pyrite tailings, which will continue to generate acid mine drainage for centuries. It also resulted in 380 radioactive mine residue areas, as well as 600,000 tons of uranium, which will remain risks for geological ages, not just biological ages. As we all are aware, uranium is both chemically toxic and radioactive, with its chemical toxicity health impacts dominating over its radioactive impacts. It also resulted in 6,000 square kilometers of badlands or wasteland. These are some of the basins within the Witwatersrand Goldfield Basin. There is the West Rand Basin, Central Basin, and East Rand Basin. These basins are now flooded with acid mine water, and since the acid mine water contains radionuclides, as the water floods the basins, the radon escapes in the open shafts, which obviously poses risks to communities living in these low-lying areas, and it is widely accepted that radon causes lung cancers. It also had devastating impacts on ecosystems and on water systems and wetlands. Now, acid mine drainage, you may be familiar, has been recognized in South Africa as a phenomenon since 1903. South Africa is a water-scarce country. However, the mining industry and the apartheid government discharged the water from these underground basins in order to secure safe mining as if it was a nuisance, discharged cheaply and quickly as possible. This now has resulted in acid mine drainage. These basins are now flooded with acid mine drainage. Acid mine drainage contains toxic metals such as cadmium, cobalt, copper, zinc, manganese, aluminium, the metalloid arsenic, as well as radioactive metals. Besides the fact that acid mine drainage causes metals to seep into the soil, ground and surface water pollution, it also wipes out aquatic biota, and it also results in the chronic exposure to acid mine drainage in the impairment of cognitive function, skin lesions, cancers. It can also affect the neural development of the fetus, which may result in mental retardation. I may just here interpose that I have borrowed most of these quotations from peer-reviewed academic reports and governmental reports with hyper-scrupulosity, attention being given to the context. This is the impacts of acid mine drainage because of its radionuclides on river systems and wetlands. This was a recreational dam, one of many receptor dams, referred to as Robinson Lake. Robinson Lake, as a result of the discharge of acid mine water, is now a declared radiation area with uranium levels at 16 milligrams per liter, which is 40,000 times above the natural uranium levels in fresh water. It also resulted in certain dams in game reserves. As you can see, this is called the Hippo Dam, and at the bottom you can see the paths that the two hippo bulls walked, where it disturbed the radioactive and toxic sludge. It also resulted in some of the animals, in this case the two hippo bulls, being covered with toxic and potentially radioactive sludge. The Tweeloopie-Spruit, which is one of the receptor rivers into which acid mine drainage containing radionuclides flows, it's in a game reserve, is now a class 5 river. That is a high acute toxic river system. It wiped out all the aquatic biota. As you can see from this picture, the yellow buoy or the precipitated heavy metals are encrusted on the bottom of the river. I may just here interpose that these metals are not in solid form permanently. It can be remobilized and solubilized under plausible environmental conditions such as acidification. These are the metals that have become encrusted in all the river systems in the gold fields of the Witwatersrand. These metals contain not only toxic metals and metalloids, but also radioactive metals. The pipes that transport the water, as you can see, it forms also precipitated metals within the pipes. The metals also are discharged into the soil. It seeps into the soil. These are grasses that are covered with metal sludge. Here is a picture that I just want to show the current treatment by the South African government of acid mine drainage. It's an incomplete method. It's called the high-density sludge process, where the pH is adjusted. All it does, it simply causes the metals to become from a soluble form into a solid form. It does not disappear from the environment. These metals contain also uranium and its daughter products or progeny, and these metals are then discharged into unlined pits, as you can see in this case. These pits are linked to the underground basins, which contains our very scarce groundwater sources. So the metals simply translate back into the voids. 20% of what is in the pits translate into the underground voids. These areas show the metal deposition, but it also show the sulfate crust. These white areas are the sulfate crust, which contain 1,100 milligrams per kilogram uranium, and this is highly soluble, so it washes into river systems and into receptor dams. These are tailings dams. These tailings dams are mostly unvegetated and significant sources of dust fallout and also water contamination. This is a picture of dust fallout which was taken in the west rand of the Witwatersrand goldfields. It is found that in the west rand alone, 42.24 tons of tailings dust per day enter the environment. And as a result of the dust fallout, about 10 tons of uranium-bound particles wash by means of stormwater into receiving water courses. It deposits on soil, on pasture, and in water. I think this is common knowledge. I will not dwell upon that. But as you may all know, if we inhale uranium particles of less than 2.5 micrograms, it enters the alveoli, crosses over the membrane of the alveoli into the bloodstream, where it can exert a systemic radiotoxic impact. With regards to the particles that cannot be inhaled, more than 2.5 microns, it is being ingested. Sorry, I refer to it as micrograms, it's microns. It translates, it then is inhaled. And because the digestive system is more aggressive than the pulmonary system, it breaks it down, and it is then stored in the bone and bone marrow, because uranium is a bone and bone marrow seeker, and it may have transgenerational impacts. Now, what is mentioned here is, in fact, what our regulator, the National Nuclear Regulator, has found in a report, that the main contaminant pathway, the radiological pathway, that is the principal pathway, is the inhalation and the ingestion of radioactive dust and the deposition of the dust on crops. We find, however, that there are inappropriate developments at the moment being authorized by the South African government. It was also done during the apartheid government, where these developments are placed on top of or adjacent to uraniferous tailings. It has been found by the Chamber of Mines in a rule of thumb that there should be no residential development within a 500-meter buffer zone of a tailings dam. However, this is not adhered to. This is most possibly the most photographed informal settlement in the world. The Canadian Globe and Mail about 2 months ago had a front page article on this very settlement. This settlement has been built since 1997 on highly toxic and radioactive tailings. It was found that the radioactivity in these tailings are 13.14 millisieverts per annum. Our regulatory limit in South Africa from one source is 250 microsieverts per annum. It's significantly elevated, and stay on contaminated land is not the only radiological pathway. There are 1,800 persons living there that are highly compromised because of HIV and AIDS, and vulnerable because of chronic and acute malnutrition. Most of the wetlands downstream of the gold and uranium mining also contain elevated levels of metals and also radioactivity. These are all the areas, it is shown in red, where you find elevated levels of radioactivity. Some of our tailings are also being used for the manufacture of bricks. It had been found by the Department of Mineral Resources of South Africa that large areas in the central business district of Johannesburg, our capital, shows elevated levels of radioactivity as a result of the use of uraniferous tailings for the manufacturing of bricks. Poorly ventilated houses may therefore be exposed to radon gas. Some of the receptor dams also show elevated levels of uranium, in this case an irrigation dam that is used to irrigate crops and for watering of cattle. The background uranium levels, where there is no gold and uranium mining, is 1 milligram per kilogram uranium. This dam contains 900 milligrams per kilogram uranium. Now, there are also desiccated dams or dry dams that contain elevated levels of radioactivity. In this case, you can see in the background there are residential developments on the bank of this dam. Our regulatory limit in South Africa for radioactivity in soil is 500 becquerels per kilogram. This specific dam contains between 10,000 and 100,000 becquerels per kilogram. It's unfenced with no warning signs in place. And perhaps while I'm busy talking, I have a bag there. Can someone just give it to me? Because now that bag there at the bottom. Yeah. Because I just have brought some samples and it cost me some money because it's very heavy. This is an airborne radiometric image. As you can see, all the areas that are shown in warm colors are elevated in radioactivity. Even a road that has been built on radioactive tailings show elevation in radioactivity. And you can also notice that these areas are within densely populated areas, and it does not only show elevation in radioactivity, but in fact high levels of radioactivity. Wetlands, where the plumes of, or where the radioactivity or the sludge migrates, also show elevation in radioactivity. These are also areas where you can see elevation of radioactivity. However, there are many communities that use the tailings to eat. This is a very common practice. I've brought some of these tailings. As you can see here, this is eaten by pregnant women and children. It's a very common practice called pica or geophasia. This is elevated in radioactivity and toxic metals. Where the acid mine water also flows on grass, this is grass. I just want to show you. It's grass, because the metals that precipitate after neutralization are then deposited or encrusted on that. I also just want to mention that many of the metals are currently adsorbed in the sediment of the river systems, but under plausible environmental conditions, it can be remobilized and solubilized. It was found by a recent researcher in the Northwest University that the cattle that drink from the river systems within the gold and uranium mining areas, the kidneys contain uranium levels 4,350 times above the control group or cattle that do not drink from this. These are now my last batch of slides. Currently in South Africa, there is a renaissance in the remining or reclamation of existing tailings dams. In the long term, it may be the best practicable environmental option if the uranium and the gold and the sulfur can be removed and the residue can be managed and safely deposited. We prefer it to be underground. However, what we do see is irresponsible remining of these tailings dams. Where mining is not completed, many of the tailings dams are then only partially remined because of the heterogeneity of the dumps or because of lack of funding by the miners. The footprints are not rehabilitated. The footprints contain residual radioactivity, and at the moment residential developments are being built on these unrehabilitated footprints. What we also see is pipeline spillages, in this case acid mine water flowing into an irreplaceable ecological site. site, a wetlands. We see spillages where, in this case, these are black goats that have, there had been spillages, uriniferous sludge spillages. We also see that, and these are on indigenous people's land, where you can see in the background is a tailings dam, but these cattle have to survive on land that is highly contaminated with radioactive and toxic tailings. And this, of course, results in death of cattle, with poor communities not having the knowledge nor the funds to contest it in court. Pipeline spillages, we can also see that it has resulted in significant sinkhole formations, acceleration of sinkhole formations, and this is my last slide. This slide shows that gold mining over more than 120, almost 130 years in South Africa did not bring benefit to South Africa. In fact, all the impacts were externalized to communities, mostly poor communities. And Anglo-American
For those of you who would like to use Twitter, we have an hashtag that is #uranium2015, so you're more than welcome to use it. And now, Dr. FAIRLIE, please.
Bonjour.
Good morning. Even though I come from London, I am a proud Canadian. It's a pleasure to be back in Quebec in Canada. I would like to thank Eric and Dale, Gordon, and especially Hugo for organizing a very large-scale conference. But even though I am bilingual, I'm going to have to speak in English for my lecture. Scientific words are a bit tougher.
You don't mind. Yeah, here we go. I have chosen to talk about global warming a little bit, and also whether nuclear power provides an answer to it or not. The reason why is because, well, it's partly because it's not covered elsewhere in the conference, but also because I think it's a very important issue. Why? Because governments and many people, newspapers especially, and even some of my former friends now still think that nuclear provides an answer, because I used to work in Canada for Greenpeace Canada, and about 7 or 8 of my former colleagues then now support nuclear power. And I find that very difficult to accept. And so I went away and studied this a little bit in order to try and understand what was going on. The reality, and the short answer to all this, is that nuclear is probably the worst way of addressing the nuclear power issue, the global warming issue. So the first question is, exactly how carbon-free is nuclear? Well, if you look at the nuclear fuel cycle, and I'm just going to quickly go through these. How do you get back? Is it this one? Yeah. You can see that there's about 9 or 10 steps involved, and all of those are heavily reliant on carbon fuels. They've all got heavy carbon footprints, especially the first 5, which are involved in the uranium mining, milling, and the fuel fabrication. But also, if you look at reactor construction and decommissioning, and also future waste disposal, these are very, very, very heavy, have got heavy carbon footprints. Most people, however, and certainly most journalists and most governments, only look at the middle one, reactor operation, and say, hey, voila, we've got a solution here. But in fact, it's not that way at all. So how do you take these all into account? Well, you have to do nuclear life cycle analysis. Yes, LCAs for short. These are a rather complicated set of studies. In fact, in the last 10 years, there's been about 300 of them published. Most of them are not even worth the paper they're written on, and they're little short of propaganda sheets for the nuclear industry. It's just been very disturbing to realize that. There are about 8 altogether, and I'll come to those in a minute. What these life cycle analyses show is that the carbon dioxide emissions depend strongly on the following: on the uranium ore grade and the ore type, how hard it is the rock that you're getting the uranium from, the enrichment method for U-235, and the future waste method. But of course, there aren't any future waste methods of disposal methods, none whatsoever in the world. So you have to make a lot of assumptions, and it's where the actual nature of those assumptions where most studies fall. Stand is that in some scenarios, nuclear power actually produces more carbon dioxide than conventional methods. And indeed, some of the people who have been doing these studies, they reckon that nuclear power stations produce less energy than is consumed in the whole of the life cycle analysis. Less. In other words, it's absolutely ridiculous. They actually consume more electricity or more energy than they actually produce. Now, this is a rather detailed slide, but very quickly, these are 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, life cycle analysis, which are a nuclear life cycle analysis, which are the best ones that I can recommend to you. And on the y-axis, it shows you the grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour produced. In comparison, a hydroelectric dam will, has this here, about roughly 6 grams per kilowatt hour. And in the UK, a government commission called the Climate Change Committee, they recommend that all new electricity sources should meet this level of 50 grams per kilowatt hour. And you can see that, that these nuclear life cycle analyses are above and below it. In other words, there are 4 which are above the recommended limit and 4 below it. In other words, it's very difficult to tell. And what I can tell you is that these 4 which are low heavily depend on a whole range of assumptions which are highly questionable. This is perhaps a more easily graspable chart which shows you the various kinds of ways of producing electricity and the grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. We're talking about nuclear, which is about, on average, 66 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. And you can see that it's actually lower than the hydrocarbon fuel ones, which are what, anywhere from 400 to 1,000 grams per kilowatt hour. But it doesn't do as well as all the others, all the renewable energies. Right? These slides will be available later on, if should you wish. The key thing I would recommend is to read these 3 studies by Sovacool and by Sovacool again and Nugent in last year, and by Keith Barnum this year in a book called The Burning Answer. Those 3 are the best studies to look at. And they, much of the information that I'm presenting comes from these 3 studies. Okay, even if we accept that nuclear power is a low carbon, relatively low carbon relative to gas and coal, is it a cost-effective way of reducing CO2? Well, no, not really. You have to compare all of these forms. And if you do that, and this is a chart from Amory Levins, difficult to read, but if you take it home and read it and download it, you'll see, you can study it. The key thing that this shows is that, this is nuclear down here, and these are mainly all the alternatives, showing you that these are the grams of carbon dioxide, say, per every dollar you spent in doing it. So quite clearly, the alternatives, the renewables, are much more cost effective than nuclear here, okay? The key thing is that if you're going to spend money on reducing CO2, this is how you do it. You do it with any other way apart from nuclear. But there are other reasons why nuclear power isn't a very good way of reducing CO2. Nuclear has got extremely high construction costs and very high generation costs. And if we look at a big proposed facility in my country, the country that I'm presently living in Britain, there's a plant there called Hinkley C that the government is proposing to build. They're going to spend $48 billion, Canadian dollars, on that, which is an eye-wateringly large amount. In fact, it's twice what the British government spent on its Olympic Games a couple of years ago. Twice. This is for one power station. You could get 2 Olympic Games for that. And it requires just ginormous government subsidies, insurance guarantees, R&D, and market interventions. This is a chart showing the increased construction costs for nuclear power. You can see that they've been rising readily. I'm going to go through these quickly. On the other hand, the renewables have been doing exactly the opposite. They've been plummeting. And just in the last, say, 6 months or so, photovoltaics have been really falling off a cliff, the prices of photovoltaics and associated battery technologies as well. As a result, nuclear power is not in a renaissance, it's in a relapse, and I get that word from Warney. Anybody who's, those journalists who continue to trumpet how wonderful nuclear is doing, well, this chart will show them exactly the opposite. This shows about 40 pull-outs, withdrawals, back-offs in the nuclear industry throughout the world from quite recently, April this year, to about 4 years ago. The red ones are in Canada, and the blue ones are in the United States. In other words, this is not evidence of a burgeoning new industry. This is evidence of an industry in massive decline. I would just highlight a couple of things. There's a big country, multinational corporation called Siemens, and most people haven't noticed it, but in 2000 it actually pulled out completely of the nuclear industry. And for Siemens to do that, it's sort of like General Electric or Ontario Power Generation pulling out of electricity. It's just amazing. And of course here in Canada, the OPG has just announced that they're going to close down Pickering, yay, at long last, in 2020. I reckon it'll be before that, well before that. And of course, in 2013, the Ontario government backed off going ahead with plans for another Darlington. And of course, here in Quebec, in 2012, the provincial government then said it wasn't going to refurbish Gentilly-2. Hey, that's great news. Well done. Just go on to the next one. But it's not just nuclear power construction costs, it's also generating costs. They are extremely high as well, due in main to the high, in fact, carrying capital costs during construction. This is another slide from Emery Lovins, on whom I borrow a lot, showing the generating costs per kilowatt hour. And it's a rather busy slide, but the take-home message again is that these are the costs, generating costs per cents per kilowatt hour. And nuclear is by far the worst, and the renewables are much lower. And this is a good slide by our friends near Savannah River, showing the nuclear generating costs are rapidly increasing over this is the y-axis in years, and showing that the solar PV costs are actually falling. And since the slide's been produced, it's gone down like this. So, as I said before, and I'll recap now, is that we are not in the middle of a nuclear renaissance. In the last decade, and I get the slide from Michael Schneider, for which thanks, about 30 gigawatts of nuclear capacity is closed. And in the same period, about 70 gigawatts of wind and another 70 gigawatts of solar thermal has been installed. This is the way that we're going in future, and I'm very pleased about it. One aspect that's not very mentioned very often, and that is jobs. This is a slide from Germany, from their environment ministry. And the green is showing you the number of jobs from 2005 to 2013, just going up. And since then, it's going way up here now. Whereas with all the other forms of electricity generation, it's falling off a cliff. Conclusions. Well, nuclear makes a very small contribution to CO2 reduction, and there are cheaper, certainly much more cost-effective, quicker, safer options. We should be going for renewables and energy efficiency. Which direction are other countries doing? Well, we can see Germany, Switzerland, and Italy are all exiting. Siemens, E.ON, and RWE, big energy utilities in Germany, they're all gone. Gentil closed, Pickering to close, and in the States, Vermont Yankee and Sonofre of two of others which are closed. We want a renewable future. And here are a bunch of references for those people who are really inclined. Thank you very much.
Dr. Ellen CALDICOTT, please.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the organisers of this conference, particularly Dr. Dale Dwyer, for organising such an important event. Especially in Canada, as we've heard, which actually instigated the first nuclear weapons in the world, because the uranium and the plutonium was derived from Canadian uranium, and Cameco is still an extraordinarily large organisation which must be closed. From the perspective of public health. What we're talking about today is public health. And I'll just read a little bit of how I feel about this as a physician. I'm trained to assess a patient, taking a detailed medical history, then conducting a careful physical examination. And that's what we're doing today. The planet is in the intensive care unit. This is followed by a series of laboratory tests which guide me to a diagnosis. Appropriate treatment follows after the illness is diagnosed and the cause identified. It's imperative that the main disease is attended to and the assessor not be distracted by peripheral issues or unrelated complaints. I look at the world and its ongoing pathology from a similar perspective. There are many serious issues facing the world at the moment, but it's necessary to triage the most serious threats, those to our very survival. It's easy to be diverted or distracted by lesser threats. These must be avoided. As a physician, I see the ever-present threat of nuclear war as an ongoing existential risk that threatens almost all planetary life with extinction. The situation is even more acute because most people and politicians have become inured to or are unaware of the existential nature of this threat. And this is a form of psychic numbing. So we're talking about uranium mining here and the effect upon the indigenous people. And I come from Australia, where uranium mining occurs on indigenous land. And there's a big push in South Australia now to bring the world's radioactive waste back to South Australia, the whole world's radioactive waste, and bury it, because that'll be great, because we'll make so much money from bringing the world's radioactive waste back and bury it on indigenous land that electricity will become free. And we can use the plutonium from the radioactive waste to power small modular reactors, which are fast reactors, which only fission 9% of the plutonium. They're cooled by liquid sodium, which explodes when exposed to air. Great reactors. And everything will be hunky-dory. And that's the new policy that's developing in the state of South Australia. These people are actually mad. MAD, mutually assured destruction. Not just of themselves, but the indigenous population and perhaps the planet. I will point out that the uranium in the Fukushima reactors was Australian uranium. So we're killing people. And already over 100 children have developed thyroid cancer in the Fukushima prefecture, but it's probably many more, because there is a big Secrecy Act now going on in Japan, where if anyone reports what's actually going on in Fukushima, they can be jailed for 10 years. The doctors have been told not to tell their patients their symptoms are related to radiation. It's the most obscene medical situation that I guess I've ever known in my medical career or throughout the world. Now, I really want to talk about what's happening, though, about nuclear weapons. And most people don't understand what is going on. There are now 16,400 nuclear weapons, mostly hydrogen bombs, massive things in the world today. Russia and America own 94% of them. Israel's got about 200 to 400 bombs, and we know that because recently that's been leaked that she actually does. We've always known it, though. So instead of concentrating on the real terrorists in the world, who are Russia and America, threatening to exterminate life on the planet, they're pointing at North Korea or Iran. That's called displacement activity. If you threaten rats in a cage with a lethal situation, they tend to run away and do something that is irrelevant to what threatens them. What really threatens us is America and Russia. And what really is threatening now is the situation in the Ukraine, which has been set up by the United States of America and the neocons in the State Department, Victoria Nuland, Robert Kagan, et al. And what they've done is organised a coup in the Ukraine, organised by America, getting rid of Yanukovych, who was the presidential elected person by a democratic system, and he fled to Russia after the Maidan situation where there was a huge uprising orchestrated by the US State Department to the tune of $5 billion in the past. And then we got Poroshenko, who is a US puppet. How often has that happened in history, I wonder, including Saddam Hussein, who worked for the CIA since he was 21. Many of them, and the Shah of Iran, have been US puppets. So what has happened is that the people in the east of Ukraine didn't want to join with the new regime, because the new regime is coordinating with the European Union and the IMF. And what the IMF and the European Union do is say, we want to make money, and you've got to tighten your belts. We're going to close down all free medical care, all free pensions, the whole thing. And people in the eastern part of Ukraine didn't want to do that. So they rose up And Russia may be supplying them with some weapons, but the Americans are supplying Poroshenko and his Nazi allies, and many of the people working with Poroshenko are ex-Nazis who are really militant and violently anti-Semitic, to fight the Eastern Europeans. Now, the New York Times, which helped to orchestrate the war in Iraq by publishing 5 front-page articles by Judith Miller, saying that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, which he did not, is pushing now to say Putin is the evil one and we have to get ready to fight Putin. The only war that America and Russia can have would be and will be a nuclear holocaust. There are 10 hydrogen bombs targeted on New York as I speak, about 60 on Washington, D.C., 60 on Moscow, and indeed most major cities in England, Europe, Russia, China, which is targeted by America since the Cold War ended for no apparent reason, Canada, and you're part of NORAD, part of the early warning system, you're right in the middle. This city is targeted with at least 1 hydrogen bomb, but probably more. America, Japan, and Australia were all targeted. Nuclear war would take about 1 hour to complete. Once the weapons are launched, they take half an hour to go from launch to land. The other country's satellite picks the attack up and they launch their weapons. It's all over in about an hour. 1 hydrogen bomb dropping on Quebec, and it could be happening now by computer error, by people hacking into the early warning system in the Pentagon, which happens over 1,000 times a day, or by human error, or by people going mad like that pilot of the German Lufthansa plane that flew into the mountain. You see, we assume that humans are infallible and totally rational and reasonable. However, if you look at the nuclear arms race, humans are crazy. They're mostly men who are in control of this, I have to say. And my next book is going to be called Why Men Kill and Why Women Let Them. I don't understand why we have to kill. As a physician, I've spent my life trying to save lives. How dare we kill each other? How dare we? And now we've learnt to destroy the only life in the universe. Maybe the algae will survive. Maybe the cockroaches. So now we've entered a period of a hot war, not a cold war, where Putin is conducting nuclear war exercises across the whole of Russia. America's conducting nuclear war exercises right now, NORAD, and is conducting flights over Washington, practicing nuclear war exercises. Putin has elevated his nuclear status to a higher state of alert. Indeed, on 9/11, American state of alert went from DEFCON 5, the lowest state of alert, DEFCON 4, 3, 2, and the next one you press the button. There are 2 men in each missile silos, of which there are hundreds, each armed with a pistol, one to shoot the other if one shows signs of deviant behaviour. Many of them have been fired, over 70 recently, because they're on drugs. They go to sleep on the job. They have floppy disks which determine whether or not they launch, and their telephones often do not work. Some of their commanders have been fired because it's very boring sitting in a silo waiting to blow up the world day by day. There are many ways nuclear war could occur and end life on Earth, but with the elevated situation between Russia and America now, where neither trust each other, we're heading on the path towards nuclear annihilation. I'm going to now drop a bomb on Quebec City, on this hotel, Delta Hotel. It's going to come in at 20 times the speed of sound. You won't hear it. It will explode right here with 6 times the heat inside the center of the sun. It will dig a hole 3/4 of a mile wide and 800 feet deep, turning us, the buildings and the earth below, to radioactive fallout shot up in the mushroom cloud. 5 miles from here, in all directions, every person will be vaporized, turn into gas. A little boy in Hiroshima was reaching up to catch a red dragonfly on his hand against the blue of the sky, and there was a blinding flash, and he disappeared, leaving his shadow behind on the pavement, which is in the Hiroshima Museum. 20 miles from here in all directions, everybody will be lethally burnt. 3rd-degree burns. People will be sucked out of buildings as missiles flying at 100 miles an hour with winds of over 1,000 miles an hour, sucking them out. Pieces of glass will be flying through the air which will decapitate people. The whole area would then be engulfed in a firestorm of 3,000 square miles, burning everything and everyone, even in the heart of winter. This is so for the whole of Canada, every university, every industrial facility, even railway crossings. Railway stations are targeted. There is such a redundancy of weapons. So we're sitting on hell, waiting to go down into the fires of hell. And nobody is talking about it, including the mainstream media. The State Department's very excited about taking on Putin. Yeah, Putin's not a good guy, but neither was George Bush, who killed over 1 million people in Iraq. What are we doing? And Canada's a main part of this, because you are exporting uranium like there's no tomorrow and selling your CANDU reactors, which make very pure plutonium, which is easy to make bombs with. That's what India did with your CANDU reactor and your uranium. And the nuclear industry is intent on spreading its nuclear power plants throughout the world, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam. They're all building nuclear power plants, which not only produce plutonium that lasts for 500,000 years, and you only need 10 pounds to make a bomb, but producing massive quantities of radioactive waste with nowhere to put it. Radioactive waste will leak into the food, bioconcentrate over time, causing epidemics of cancer, leukemia, and genetic disease. So uranium's a great mineral, isn't it? And as the indigenous people say, it should be left in the ground. They know how to look after the earth. We, Caucasians, do not. How do we get a handle on these characters in Washington, in your government? Harper just lies down in front of the American officials. So does my Prime Minister, called Tony Abbott, one of the worst Prime Ministers we've ever had. How do we get a handle on these men who think they have to kill? But by killing with nuclear weapons, they're going to destroy probably the only life in the universe. And I don't think it's if, I think it's when. Things are getting so bad now, and we're all practicing a kind of psychic numbing, walking like lemmings towards the cliff of annihilation, not even seeing, hearing, or understanding what's going on. I held a conference on this at the end of February called The Dynamics of Possible Nuclear Extinction. We got no coverage in the mainstream media at all. Stephen Hawking et al. Are now saying that artificial intelligence, which is really moving very fast, could within about 10 years, the computers could initiate a nuclear war by themselves. America is going to spend over $1 trillion in the next 30 years replacing every single nuclear weapon, every single missile, ship, plane. $1 trillion. When how many children in the world are starving? How dare they? And you know why that happened? For Obama to get the START II treaty through Congress, he had to promise Senator Kyle that he would spend $1 trillion in the next 30 years to replace every single nuclear weapon. All the nuclear weapons labs, Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore, Sandia, are now run by private companies, Bechtel et al. This whole thing is insane. And the average person knows nothing about it. It's good for us to do this here, but unless we produce this material and get it on the media to educate Mr. and Mrs. Joe Brown sitting in front of their television, nothing will happen. Politicians don't respond to anything except the power of an educated people, and at the moment the people in this country and indeed in the world are totally ignorant and uneducated. We walk blindly towards our annihilation. We're a very special species. Are we an evolutionary aberrant? Or are we smart enough to evolve psychologically and spiritually to do the right thing, to survive? Canada has a great responsibility. You must stop uranium mining. You must close down Cameco. You must get rid of Harper. You once had a great Prime Minister, Trudeau. I had lunch with Trudeau. And you were testing cruise missiles in Canada. And I said, the majority of people in Canada do not want cruise missiles tested. In a democracy, he said, you know, if we had a real democracy, everyone would have guns in Canada. So I didn't know what to say. I couldn't get through to him till I said, what about your children? And he loved those little boys. And he took on the 5-continent, 6-nation peace initiative. Highly intelligent, highly moral man. Where are your moral leaders? Women. Where are the women? 52% of the world's population are women, and we're pathetic. We should be leading. We have the babies. We've got the hormones to nurture and love and care. Yeah, there are a lot of good men too here. But boy, do we need a revolution in thinking and action. Or I'm sorry to say, we're doomed. I've been doing this for 44 years. I don't know what else to do now. But, you know, one person can lead a revolution. I helped to in America, and here with If You Love This Planet. Don't tell me that every single one of you, if powerful enough and in touch with your passion and care enough about the planet and the roses about to bloom, cannot lead a revolution in Canada. It's up to you. Thank you.